Good afternoon, ladies. I'm Michelle Austen, president of the Claire Booth Luce Center for Conservative Women. Thank you all for coming today, and welcome to our February Conservative Women's Network lunch. Special thank you to Bridget Weisenberger, who is the Coalition Relations Coordinator at the Heritage Foundation. We've had a partnership now with Heritage for 20 years, and we love it. I hope you all had a wonderful Valentine's Day. Maybe got a little chocolate or did something special. But with love and relationships at the top of our minds, we've asked author Elizabeth Kantor to speak today about these issues. She's going to tell us why, as women, we should lean into love and marriage first. She's an editor at Regnery Publishing, where she works for the incredible publisher Margie Ross, who we've also had speak at CWN, and the author of this wonderful book, The Jane Austen Guide to Happily Ever After, as well as the Politically Incorrect Guide to English and American Literature. This is one of my favorite books, and I've told you that. I love Jane Austen, and I love your book and the way you analyze it and the way you relate it to today's relationships. And she's going to sell and sign copies of the book after she speaks back where we have our lunch. She earned her PhD in English from the University of Carolina at Chapel Hill and an MA in philosophy from Catholic University of America. She's taught English literature in college and written for many, many publications, ranging from National Review Online to USA Today. Her hobbies include reading, gardening, matchmaking, and learning poetry by heart. She's currently on a pace to memorize all 154 of Shakespeare's sonnets by her 60th birthday, and I hope you're going to tell us what your favorite one is so far. She and her husband are happily married. They have a grown son and celebrating their 30th wedding anniversary this year. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Kantor.
Thanks so much, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle. Okay. Many of you may have seen this book, Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg. In this bestseller and influential book, Sandberg laments that only 21 of the Fortune 500 CEOs are female. Only 18% of Congress are women. She thinks this means that men still rule the world. And a truly equal world, she says, would be one where women ran half our countries and companies and men ran half of our households. I'm here today to tell you that Sheryl Sandberg is wrong. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the fact that women are in fewer leadership positions in the world and that hardly any men run households. This is not what's wrong with the world. It's not what's making men and women unhappy. In fact, women are right to prioritize our relationships ahead of our careers, and especially over money and power, at least the kind of power that Sandberg is talking about. We're right to do that for two reasons. The first one should not be controversial at all, although I think we give it more lip service than we really believe it. That's the fact that relationships and people are more important than money and power. That's something I hope we can all agree on, right? But the second reason is extremely controversial. In fact, it's essentially becoming a thought crime. And that's the idea which I'm going to try to sell you on, which is that women have a special natural capacity for relationships and making connections between people. So on what authority do I make these claims? Well, I'm going to bring three different kinds of authority to bear. The first one is hard science and social science research. There's actually a lot of evidence that men and women are different in a lot of other ways besides the obvious ones that we can see, ranging from a 2000 study by Jennifer Connellan and Simon Baron Cohen, observing what newborns' eyes follow, and establishing that newborn baby boys tend to follow moving objects more with their eyes, whereas newborn baby girls tend to look at faces more follow faces more with their eyes. To more recent research showing from some Scandinavian countries that actually the more equal and prosperous a society is, the less women choose to do traditionally male occupations. So in Finland, there are, even though women do better in school than men, and it's a very prosperous country, and in other words, women have more choices there than in, some desperately poor place. They choose to become engineers and math professors less than they do than women who are in more desperate circumstances do traditionally men's work. My second kind of evidence is from my personal life. Now here, I'm going to kind of obnoxiously toot my own horn for a minute. Despite the fact that Sheryl Sandberg is 100% right that it's particularly unattractive when women brag compared to when men do, but for the sake of the credibility of the argument, I'm going to just tell you that I have a totally plum and posh job, right? So I get to edit books at Regnery. I have one of those window offices a couple of blocks from the Capitol. I have published a couple of books. I've gotten, one was reviewed in Time magazine, another one sold tens of thousands of copies. When it comes to, so I admit, there's like 4 people reporting to me, and there's like 35,000 people reporting to Sheryl Sandberg, so it's not really comparable. But I would make a case that there is power in my job in the sense that I worked on books that actually influenced the 2016 election. So I was the editor on Untitled Adios America, for example, which I think has some claim to have kind of highlighted the immigration issue and made a big difference in that election. Let me just pause for a minute and talk about the kind of power that Sheryl Sandberg's talking about in her job. It seems to me that mostly what she's excited by is the possibility of managing a lot of people and helping them fulfill their potential and get things done, which is a great thing, a very satisfying thing to do. And it's also obviously the job she was born for. I mean, she has this hilarious thing about the toast that her younger siblings gave at her wedding about how, they didn't have much potential when they were toddlers, but she knocked them into shape. And, it's like her talent is to do that, right? But I feel like from looking at her, reading her book and looking at the news about her online, which, I'm no Sheryl Sandberg expert, but I looked up a few things, that she's missing, that her definition of power is kind of incomplete, right? I mean, she's very excited about the fact that she got pregnant, like special parking spaces for Silicon Valley workers at Google who, were pregnant and had to walk all the way across a couple of parking lots. And to me, that seems like a first world problem compared to the really significant problems in the world. And one of the significant problems that I'm afraid Sheryl Sandberg is actually contributing to is what one critic of her career calls capitalist surveillance, where, Facebook is collecting data about you and selling it to people. And she was actually apparently blamed by Mark Zuckerberg for letting have you heard of the Cambridge Analytica scandal? Okay, which has something to do with Russian collusion, which I cannot follow the whole thing at all. But it would appear that Facebook was somehow selling data to somebody who was trying to help Donald Trump get elected, which I can't imagine is something that Sheryl Sandberg wanted, right? So there she is just going along with her corporate culture, right? And maybe making something happen that is not, if she would step back a little bit from being enmeshed in that, maybe she wouldn't want to contribute to. I contrast her to my grandmother, who was literally a 1950s housewife, right, before women's lib, which was short, that's what they called feminism in the 70s, right? That was short for women's liberation, as if women were all, who were housewives, were all captives or else slaves, right? That's who needs liberation. So there's my grandmother in the 1950s, a housewife, and she does volunteer work. She starts the Memphis Food Bank. She builds a retirement home for people who can't, poor women who can't afford to take care of themselves in their old age. And she volunteers as the chairwoman of Democrats for Eisenhower in the election in the 1950s, right? Why? Well, because she wanted to keep Adlai Stevenson out of the White House. Well, why did people want to keep Adlai Stevenson out of the White House? Because he was, as they said then, an egghead, right? So we would say today he was an East Coast intellectual elite. That was kind of the beginning of the Democratic Party's change into what it is today, right? So I feel like my grandmother helped postpone for 50 years, that is, from the election of Eisenhower to the election of Barack Obama, the takeover of our government by this East Coast elite. And that seems to me like it was a real exercise of power that is more impressive than anything that Sheryl Sandberg can lay claim to. But in any case, talking about any kind of power that you have in work or volunteer life, or and the perks that come along with your job, I have to tell you that in comparison to family life, to my relationships with my husband and my son and my friends, it's not just that relationships outweigh all the satisfactions and the rewards that I've had in my job or in my political life. It's that those sort of public satisfactions are like feather light. They don't even weigh in the balance compared to relationships. I mean, if you think about what happens when you form a family, right? I mean, first you fall in love, and I'm transitioning a little bit to my third source of authority here, which is literature, because while there's science and then there's history. History can tell you, historians can tell you, they look at public documents, they look at material culture, and literature is just fiction, except that it's fiction that lets you into the actual mind, like what people were actually thinking in all of world history. And if it's great literature, if it's Jane Austen or William Shakespeare, then its stock in trade is brilliant insights into the things that matter most to human beings, right? So here's a quote from Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Head Revisited that is about falling in love. He says, "To know and love one other human being is the root of all wisdom." Okay, so that's kind of how you start out. You fall in love with somebody, you marry him, and then it becomes a lifelong adventure story where the two of you are sort of like encountering and navigating, like there's a new hurdle all the time, right? And it looks different. It's in a different guise each time at each stage of your life, each challenge or whatever. But each time, even though it looks really different, what you're doing is you're deciding whether to keep loving and to learn to love better, right? So it's like anyway, it's a lifelong adventure basically, and what you're deciding here. Here's to quote. You said my favorite Shakespeare sonnet, which is actually number 116. So I'll quote that. You're learning. You're putting into practice. Love, which is, as Shakespeare says, not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come, right? So time takes away a lot of things, your good looks, your energy, your, but the trick is that love is, you're hanging on to that despite these other things falling away, I guess. Anyway, so on this question of what's really important, your career or your relationships, Jane Austen, as it happens, agrees with me, or maybe we should say I agree with her, right? In a letter to her brother when it was coming out that it was like a secret that she wrote Pride and Prejudice. It was anonymously published, but it was coming out, and she wrote, after all, what a trifle it is. She's talking about writing Pride and Prejudice. I mean, that, and people knowing it, that's a huge thing, right? But to her, what a trifle it is in all its bearings to the really important points of one's existence. So to Jane Austen, the really important points of her existence were her relationships. I mean, she didn't get married and have children, but she was living the typical life of a spinster and being the greatest aunt in the world and caring about her sister. And so to her, too, relationships were, absolutely the crucial thing. Okay, so getting back to the thesis I'm trying to prove, that women have a natural capacity for relationships. I've got a couple of Jane Austen quotes along these lines. Here's Mr. Darcy. A lady's imagination is very rapid. It jumps from admiration to love, from love to matrimony in a moment. Okay, so we're thinking long-term about relationships, I think, more than guys are typically. And, we don't like to admit that in a way, or it's irritating to us when it's pointed out, because it's a vulnerability, right? I mean, if we care more than they do, then we're at a disadvantage in a certain way. And they can say some snarky thing like Mr. Darcy did there, right? But Jane Austen, while she sees the vulnerability, she also sees that there's a lot of strength in this, right? And when Anne Elliot is talking to Captain Harville at the end of Persuasion, in that famous scene where she's talking about women's nature, she says it's in women's nature not to be able to get over lost love basically as easily as a man can. She paints a picture of women as typically and naturally more invested in relationships than men, but she calls it a claim for her sex. It's a kind of capacity that she claims that women have, over and above men. And this is a strength of women, partly because, and again, it shouldn't be controversial except for all this cultural Marxism that is infecting the world like a nasty virus. Relationships are more important than power and money, right? And the world today is in desperate need of women's expertise at making connections and nurturing relationships. Both life expectancy and IQ are dropping in the American population for the first time in history. And the life expectancy is definitely partly because of loneliness. I'm going to quote and give some data from a couple of economists named Ann Case and Angus Deaton here, who talk about deaths of despair, right? Part of the reason that the life expectancy of Americans is dropping is all the drug overdoses and suicides that we have now, which are partly caused by loneliness. Social isolation, living alone and not having connections with friends and stuff, is as dangerous for your health as smoking. It's more dangerous for your health than being overweight. It's more dangerous for your health than never exercising. So it's a real health risk apart from anything else. And right now in affluent nations like America, we've got the highest rates of people living alone in human history, and it's getting worse. Why? Well, partly we're just spoiled rotten by having enough money that we can all afford our own apartment, and when you go to college, the dorms are all, that are newly being built are single occupancy rooms, and you don't have to learn how to get along with a roommate, right? So I do think that, that's part of it. But it's also the playing out of some social trends that were driven by an ideology that I think is really wrong, starting with the sexual revolution in the 60s, the women's lib movement in the 70s, and the divorce revolution that happened at the same time with the triumph of feminism. Next, the explosion of illegitimacy and what they call the cohabitation revolution, right? So now we've got a problem that people are not even forming families, or at least it's only, the people who are still forming families are just the kind of upper crust of upper middle class folks. And other people are having children outside wedlock, and then there's no, they don't have the same kind of connections. the groundwork for all this was laid in the 1970s, which I can remember, particularly the divorce revolution. When I was a little girl, I knew a couple of other girls whose parents were divorced, but it was a rare thing, like somebody who had, a birth defect or a scar from a fire they were in when they were a kid. It was just a rare, odd thing. Then all of a sudden, this divorce epidemic just hit the suburbs and ran through all the families I knew, and half of everybody's parents got divorced, including mine. And that was happening at the same time that the women's lib movement was saying, you should go out and work, right? So, and then people needed to work because they had gotten divorced, and so what I particularly remember was this premise that essentially all the traditional jobs that women had done to hold their households together. I mean, everything from yes, you should stay married for the sake of the kids, to coordinating your kids' activities and helping them be launched in the world and keeping your extended family connected, and just making lunch, all those things were nothing, right? So they would take care of themselves. Nobody needed to do any of those things. The only valuable and meaningful thing was to go out into the world and get a job like a guy, right? Which is kind of ironic because now women complain that they have two jobs. They have to manage the whole household, and but then it was just like nothing, of no significance. So what's my point? Okay, all that happened 40 years ago, and you can tell I'm still mad about it, right? But am I saying we should all go back and be housewives? Well, actually, no. Okay, so it is true that the labor participation rate for women spiked in the late 60s and early 70s, I think mostly because of the divorce, right? But if you look at Bureau of Labor Statistics, I could find them back to 1890, right? So there's a steady increase in women working outside the home from 1890 until about 1964, and that's really nothing to do with feminism. That's to do with the economy. In the Middle Ages, the half of the human race that gestates the next generation, gives birth to them, breastfeeds them, really just couldn't afford to be away from home, right? But by the time the washing machine and the vacuum cleaner were invented, thank you, and ambitious men who like to tinker with machines, then that really frees up a lot of space in our lives to be able to do other things, which is great for women like me who are are ambitious and like intellectual work and are kind of bossy and loud, right? So I've got a friend who calls women like us. We have a kind of a girls' night out, and we go out and all talk too loud at the restaurant and boss people around. Anyway, so she says we have testosterone poisoning, right? So this was a joke until in 2000 and something, studies started to come out saying that there is a minority of women who got high levels of testosterone in the womb, right? And you can tell if you're one of these women if you look at your right hand. So if you look at your right hand, okay, and you look and you see whether your index finger or your ring finger is longer, right? So in most women, the index finger is longer than the ring finger. In most men, the ring finger on the right hand is longer than the index finger. And in women who were exposed to unusual levels of testosterone for girls in the womb, they're like guys that I have like my ring finger is like way longer than than the index finger. So they're, but despite the fact that I admit to this testosterone, poisoning is an ugly way to talk about it, but that's my friend's joke. Despite that, still, I have a natural capacity for nourishing relationships that my husband just doesn't really have. I quit my job to stay home with our son when he was little, but by the time he was in high school, I was working long hours in DC, and my husband, who now teaches Latin at the school where my son went, he was home with them all afternoon, all the time, right? But my son would tell you, and it's absolutely true, that even though I spent far fewer hours with him every week, I knew all about what was going on in his head compared to my husband. I mean, it's just, like women's intuition. So anyway, that's, anyway, so okay, so what's the takeaway, right? I'm gonna move on to some advice. First, career advice, and then the more important relationship advice. What it means to prefer relationships over power and money in your career is that sometimes you're going to want to put your family life first, right? So that can mean not being ashamed to pick a career that's a traditionally female career that's based on relationships. I mean, that can be anything from writing great novels like Jane Austen, which are all about relationships, to deciding that you want to be a nurse or a physical therapist because that's going to free up time when you have little kids, right? Even though if those are pink-collar jobs, right? It can also mean, if you have ambitions, exercising supernatural patience about them. I mean, this is what Jane Austen did. She started writing fiction when she was about 10 years old. And she did not publish her first novel published, which was Sense and Sensibility, until she was 35, right? So it took her 25 years to get from, I want to do this, to I'm successful at it. And in fact, it was 15 years between the time she started writing that particular novel and the time that got published. Anyway, I think patience can pay off. She never had that room of her own that Virginia Woolf claims you have to succeed at writing. She prioritized her relationships. Her nieces and nephews, it never occurred to them that she had anything more important to do than to play with them. But she did some really important things in her spare time. So if we keep at our ambitions when we can, as steadily as we can, in the interstices of paying attention to the things that are really important, I think we can get a lot of career things done as well. But so much for career advice, and the last thing I want to do is give a little bit of relationship advice, because that's the most important thing. For most of us, that's going to mean family. I think you'll probably, if you're not married already, you'll probably all be getting married at some point. If you doubt that or despair of that, I would recommend the Jane Austen Guide, which is full of dating tips, courtship advice, and really advice about arranging your own marriage, which is what Jane Austen heroines do. But just kind of skipping over that too, assuming you do end up married with a family. Marriage is your best chance, I think, for most of us. I mean, there are people who learn it other ways, but for most of us, marriage is the best chance at learning what it's really like to love another person, right? Because love for people far away and love for humanity in the abstract can quite easily be imaginary. Whereas love for somebody that you're actually rubbing against in day-to-day life has to be real or not exist, right? So, I mean, the difference is the thing where you think you love people that you don't really know very well. Actually, Flannery O'Connor talks about people whose moral energy increases in direct proportion to the distance from home, right? So I think there's a lot of truth in charity begins at home. Okay, my main piece of advice for you, if you get married, is don't get a divorce. Okay, that seems very simple. The sociology advice is if you are in an unhappy marriage, and the sociologists ask you, tell us about your marriage, and say it's unhappy, and then the sociologists come back in 5 years and they ask if you're still in the marriage, you could be very likely happy, right? So, I mean, there's just a lot of social science evidence that people often make a mistake and leave a marriage that they think is unhappy, right? I want to talk about give two particular examples from my experience. I'm now old enough that my friends' kids, some of them who got married early, are getting divorced. So this is for a young people anti-divorce piece of advice. What the mother who's my friend will tell me is about her daughter's husband. They got married a year ago. He turned out to be a terrible person. Okay. Now we're not talking about a situation where he's beating her or it's a dangerous situation for her. We're talking about a situation where maybe he's selfish about money, right? He turned out to be a terrible person. Well, no kidding. I mean, that's what people are like, right? I mean, there's like original sin. We all turn out to be terrible people. If you live with somebody, he's going to turn out to be a terrible person. You're going to turn out to be a terrible person some of the time. And, that's kind of the point of the whole thing, is to like stop being such a terrible person and figure out how to love somebody who often is a terrible person, I guess. And then the other thing I see is women my age who, I feel like observing that there's a phenomenon where women, like the biological drive to mate and have young and launch them into the world is kind of like satisfied at my age. And then it's like, why should I have to put up with living with this guy anymore, right? And they'll just like turn on a dime and decide that they want to get divorced. I mean, it can be quite annoying to live with a man. I mean, there's all kinds of, right? So, but marriage is supposed to be about more than fulfilling your biological drive, right? I mean, we're not animals. We're human beings, and we can reach for something better than that. To keep that promise that lovers all want to make, which is "I'll love you forever," right? My final piece of advice is treat marriage vows and even all the poetry about love that is out there, treat it not as sort of like aspirational claptrap that sounds really good at your wedding and you take the pic, but treat it as an actual program for what you're going to do, right? I mean, what you're going to do is, to have and to hold, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. Or to quote Shakespeare, let me not to, this is Sonnet 116 again, at the beginning, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. Married love is both the best picture of and the best opportunity for most of us to learn to live what Dante calls the love that moves the sun and the other stars. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I know you all have some questions. Don't be shy, right? Let me ask the first one. Okay. You've been here. Come on. Okay. You've been married 30 years.
Well, almost in December. Yeah.
All right. I'll give you 30. What's the number one thing? First, it's not easy. Okay? It's not easy to be married 30, 45 years. It's not easy. But what's the number one thing you would say that was key to the success that made you last 30 years?
Well, then we both kept believing that, it's just not a question whether you quit. Do you know what I mean? Like your children can give you enormous amounts of grief, right? They can hurt you, I would say easily as much as your spouse can hurt you. Your kid can become an alcoholic. Your kid can go to jail. Your kid, right? Okay, but nobody says, this is just too much. I'm not his mother anymore, right? But people say that about their husbands all the time. They decide that they're just not putting up with it anymore, right? So, it helped being Catholic and having this idea that, the New Testament, Jesus in the Bible says, Moses gave you divorce, but it was not so from the beginning. God created male and female. And what God has joined, let nobody, So if you just sort of assume that this is a permanent, marriage creates a relationship that's as real and permanent as the relationship that you have with your kids, then it's kind of, the whole thing's different, right?
Okay. Yes, if you give your name and affiliation here in the mic, thank you, and then I'll let you call on others.
Hi, Teresa Manning with the Martin Center for Academic Renewal. Thank you so much for your funny and fun remarks.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the work you do. You're in North Carolina, is that right?
Yeah, I'm here in the DC area, but we're headquartered in.
Yeah, because I was at Chapel Hill and
Oh, great.
great stuff. They're kind of calling those folks to account.
Yeah, I was a little surprised you touched so briefly on biology and also didn't mention that she who rocks the cradle rules the world. Seems like that might have come into play. But with respect to biology, and I used to run the nation's family planning office, so I'll bring up a few things about human fertility. Female fertility is greatest from the age of 15 to 25. It's declining from 25 to 35, and from 35 onward, it is plummeting. And I wonder if you've thought at all about the education system, college, graduate school, law school, associate attorney, becoming partner, and then at the age of 30, 35, contemplating starting a family. And whether we could think about how this trajectory, which is obviously based on a male trajectory, where fertility is constant and is not cyclical and doesn't decline. I think also of Barbara Bush, who married at 19. And just a few generations ago, women did marry much younger, but it seems like the education system is discouraging that, at least for most middle class and upward women. So would you want to comment on that, the tension between the fertility, biological reality, and the professional and educational trajectory that was obviously originally fashioned for males?
Well, I think it's a balancing act, right? I mean, from the fertility point of view, it does seem like there's a lot of disadvantages to the sort of current upper middle class blue state ideal, which is well, I mean, the part of it where you have a lot of irresponsible sex before you get married is just like a flat out bad idea, right? But and then at some point before you're like the ideal thing would be to get married exactly at, I don't know, 29 or whatever, right? Like that. I mean, obviously you're foreclosing a lot of fertility possibilities if your idea is that you don't get married until you're established, right? On the other hand, women who used to get married in their teens, not all that long ago, you can have, I mean, I know a woman who has 20 children, right? So, there's, like that has its challenges too, right? I mean, I would love to have 20 children, but not everybody wants that many. And it's, it's a strain on your body. And, so Jane Austen is really all about balance, right? And so, I don't think it really makes sense to 100% maximize your fertility. And I don't think it makes sense to 100% maximize, getting everything perfect before you have children either. And I think also, you just have to, I mean, there's a lot of things to balance there, right? And the other thing is that from a marital happiness point of view, there's also advantages and disadvantages to early marriage. So if you get married very early, you're more likely to get divorced because your judgment in picking, I mean, that's a fact that you're more likely to get divorced if you get married like in your teens, right? Or even I think in your early 20s. My opinion about why that is, or observation, is that people's judgment improves over time, right? So you're not so good at picking somebody when you're very young. On the other hand, if you get married later, you have less marital satisfaction because you have your own separate life and he has his own separate life, and so you don't have as many experiences together, and maybe you don't bond as well. So I think there's probably a happy medium in all these things. Anybody else? The main thing is when you have met somebody that you love and would be a really great husband, go for him, whether you're 21 or 30, right? I mean, that's the main thing is to marry the right person.
Hi, I love your book. I read it a couple times.
Oh, thank you.
Huge fan. So my question, I'm just interested to know that you love the sonnet from Shakespeare that actually Marianne Dashwood quotes. It's kind of ironic because she turns out to have picked not a great one in that case.
Yeah.
And maybe she's
Yeah.
a bit too romantic, as you argue in your book. So I guess following up on that, where do you see the intersection of romance and common sense in kind of the courtship dating process?
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, again, just going by Jane Austen, it's all about balance, right? I mean, people, Jane Austen's heroines are doing a kind of a balancing act. I mean, there are foils in the book. There are characters that we don't approve of in the book who are at opposite extremes from each other, whereas the heroines are right in the middle, right? So there are calculating mercenary women in Jane Austen's novels, and there are foolish romantic women with bad judgment in Jane Austen's novels. And the trick is to, as I say, arrange your own marriage. In other words, in Jane Austen novels, the heroines they take on the responsibility that parents had back in the days of arranged marriage, to look at very practical things like, will we have enough money to live on, right? Is this man a good bet, or is he a dangerous alcoholic and philanderer, right? So those are you have to look into those practical concerns. But Jane Austen does not approve of marrying people for money or for other cynical reasons, or if you don't love them. I mean, partly because, the main reason is that it's just really not honest. I mean, no man wants to marry you if you don't really love him. And so if you marry him without really loving him, then you're telling him this huge lie about the most important thing in life.
Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Lene Deacon, interning at the U.S. House of Representatives. My question would be, in our culture today, dating is a rather new phenomenon, right? So courtship would be traditionally what we would do. So what is your opinion on how long someone should court or date, and what should happen in that time? And I'm just very curious to hear your opinion on that, as we live in a culture of non-committal, delayed adolescence.
Yeah. I guess I'd say, to me, it seems like the length of time is, I don't think you could, put a number on it, right? I mean, I do think, I think the trick is more structural rather than length of time. In Jane Austen's day, which honestly, I really think they sort of got it right in terms of courtship, that, they were leaving arranged marriage behind, but they hadn't gotten into the crazy modern problems. So the women today are typically trying to do two incompatible things, whereas in Jane Austen's day, those things were sharply divided and you didn't have to try to do them at the same time, right? Okay, so on the one hand, women today are trying to, just like single women in Jane Austen's day, they're trying to figure out whether the man that they're interested in or is interested in them would be a good match for them. Okay, we'll have to figure that out before we get married. However, women today are very often also trying to do something that's completely incompatible with that, which is basically to be a good wife to that person on some kind of probation, right? So, in Jane Austen's day, a man pursued a woman, and he didn't have a right to ask her for any kind of commitment until he proposed, essentially. So if you were a man in Jane Austen's day and you said, "I love you," then that meant, "and I want to marry you, would you like to get engaged?" Right? Now, a guy will say he loves you, he will try to get you in bed, he will, expect you to live with him and keep house for him. All these things, right? And it's if you're in a relationship, I mean, to some extent, even if you're just somebody's girlfriend, but certainly if you're living with a guy, it's going to be very difficult not to take on this job that women kind of naturally take on, which is being a good wife and making the relationship work no matter what, which makes a lot of sense if you really are a wife. And I'm totally for that if you really are a wife. But it's not a good idea if you're not one, because how can you just can't do those things at once. See whether it should work and make it work, right? So I guess I'd say the important part is the structural part. Do what you can to keep the relationship on a basis where, you're gathering information and experience enough to be able to tell whether this should work without getting so close that you can't see straight anymore. And you're already committed. I mean, the sociologists call this sliding instead of deciding, right? That, you live with a guy and then you want to make it work no matter what.
One more? Anyone? Well, let me ask you. You love Jane Austen, you've written about her. After I read this, I went back.
And read the novels?
Yeah. What's your favorite Jane Austen and why?
I can't really say.
Oh, come on.
I think it's funny. I think she gets better and better. So, although I think, Persuasion, she didn't get a chance to revise as much as she would have. So Emma's the last one that she wrote and worked completely on, and then there's an unfinished one, Sanditon, after So I think maybe Emma is the greatest Jane Austen novel. Everybody loves Pride and Prejudice. Is like, if y'all have read the Narnia Chronicles, okay. So the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is just kind of like a mishmash of all kinds of crazy things. And then he gets better as he's writing, right? And by the time he's to the end of the series with the last battle, it's great. But The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is like Pride and Prejudice. It's like, it's earlier on, but it's this genius thing that she hit on that nobody could ever do again. Just inspiration struck. So, they're all great.
Well, thank you very much. We have a couple of gifts for you here.
Oh, thank you.